The night he left me in the rain was the night I realized I meant nothing to the man who once promised me everything. I didn't fall right away, not at first. I just stood there on the side of the road, heels sinking into wet asphalt. The rain coming down so hard it blurred the streetlights into streaks of gold and white, my hair clinging to my face, my dress heavy against my skin like it didn't belong to me anymore, like nothing did, and I could still see the faint red glow of his taillights disappearing into the distance. Not slowing, not hesitating, not looking back, just gone, like I had never been in that car at all, like I had never been in his life at all. And I remember thinking maybe he'd stop. Maybe this was just anger, just another fight, just another moment that would pass like all the others. But the road stayed empty and the silence grew louder than the storm. And that's when it hit me, slow and cold, that he wasn't coming back, that he had meant it when he told me to get out. That I had stepped out into the rain expecting him to cool down, expecting him to open the door again, but instead I was standing alone on a dark road miles from anywhere with nothing but the sound of rain hitting pavement and my own breathing, trying to keep steady. And I didn't have my phone because I'd left it in the car, didn't have my purse because he'd thrown it into the back seat and driven off before I could reach for it. Didn't even have a jacket because I hadn't expected to be standing outside for more than a few seconds. And now the cold was starting to creep in, slow and sharp, wrapping around my arms, my legs, my chest, until I felt like I was shrinking into myself just to stay warm. And cars passed sometimes, headlights flashing by, slowing just enough for drivers to look, to take in the sight of a woman alone in the rain. But none of them stopped, none of them rolled down a window or asked if I was okay. They just kept going, like I was part of the storm, something temporary, something not worth interrupting their night for. And I couldn't blame them because if I saw myself from the outside, I might have kept driving too, soaked, shaking, standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I don't know how long I stayed like that. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 20. Time felt strange, stretched thin between each drop of rain hitting my skin, between each breath that came out colder than the last, until my legs started to feel weak, and I had to take a step back just to keep my balance. And that's when I heard it. Not loud, not sudden, just the quiet hum of an engine pulling up behind me, slow, controlled, deliberate, not like the other cars that rushed past without a second thought. This one stopped, right there, close enough that I could feel the presence of it before I turned around. And for a second I didn't move because I didn't know what I'd see. Didn't know if it would be another person passing by or something else entirely, something I wasn't ready for. But then the car door opened, the sound cutting clean through the rain, and footsteps followed, steady, measured, not hurried, not unsure, just certain, like whoever was walking toward me already knew exactly what they were doing. And I turned slowly, my vision blurred by water and exhaustion, and I saw him, tall, dark coat, standing under the streetlight like the rain didn't touch him the way it touched everything else, like it moved around him instead of through him. And he didn't say anything at first, just looked at me, really looked, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with something sharper, something that made me feel seen in a way I wasn't ready for, like he could read everything that had just happened without me saying a single word. And for a moment I forgot how to breathe, because no one had looked at me like that in a long time. Not even the man who had just left me behind. And then he stepped closer, just enough to close the distance between us, and without asking, without hesitating, he took off his coat and placed it over my shoulders, the fabric. Warm, heavier than I expected, smelling faintly of something clean and expensive, something that didn't belong to the night I was standing in, and I flinched slightly, not because of him, but because I wasn't used to someone doing something like that without wanting something in return, and he noticed. I know he did, because his eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in understanding, and then he spoke, his voice low, steady, cutting through the storm like it had been waiting for the right moment. "Get in," he said, simple, direct, like it wasn't a question, like it wasn't something I needed to think about. And I shook my head before I even realized I was doing it. Instinct kicking in, the part of me that still tried to protect itself even when everything else had fallen apart. And I took a step back, the coat slipping slightly on my shoulders, the rain immediately finding its way back to my skin, and I whispered, "I'm fine." Even though my voice barely worked, even though nothing about me was fine. And he watched me for a second longer, the silence stretching between us, and then he stepped closer again, just enough that I could see the details of his face, the sharp lines, the calm expression, the kind of control that didn't need to prove itself, and he leaned in slightly, not threatening, not forceful, just close enough that I could hear him over the rain when he said, "Stay here and freeze, or come with me." And something in the way he said it made my chest tighten because it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't exaggerated, it was just true, and I looked past him at the empty road, at the darkness stretching out in both directions, and then back at him, at the open car door. Behind him, the soft glow of light spilling out from inside, warm, steady, real, and I realized I had already made one wrong choice tonight. I had already trusted the wrong person, stayed when I should have left, believed something that wasn't real, and I didn't have the strength to make another mistake. Not out here. Not like this, so I nodded, just once, barely noticeable, and stepped forward, letting him guide me toward the car without touching me again, without rushing me, just opening the door wider and waiting until I slid into the seat, the warmth hitting me immediately, wrapping around me like something I had forgotten existed, and as the door closed and the sound of the rain softened to a distant rhythm against the glass, I finally let out the breath I had been holding, my hands still shaking in my lap, my body still trying to understand what had just changed, and across from me, he sat down, his gaze never leaving my face, studying me like I was something important, something that mattered, and after a moment, he spoke again, quieter this time, but somehow even more certain. "He left you," he said, and I felt something break inside my chest at the way he said it, not asking, not guessing, just knowing, and before I could respond, before I could explain or deny or say anything at all, he added, "I don't." The car did not feel like a rescue at first. It felt like silence, thick and heavy, the kind that presses against your chest and makes every thought louder than it should be, and I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, fingers still trembling, watching the rain slide down the tinted window in slow, uneven lines while the city lights blurred into something distant and unreal, like I had already been removed from the life I knew and placed somewhere else without warning, and across from me he did not look away, not even once, his gaze steady, unreadable, like he was waiting for something I did not know how to give, and I tried to find words, anything to explain why I was here, why I had gotten into a stranger's car in the middle of the night without asking questions, but nothing came out except a quiet breath that I did not realize I had been holding, and he noticed that too, of course he did, because he seemed to notice everything, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was softer, but no less certain. "You are shaking," he said, not as an observation, but as a fact, and I looked down at my hands like I could hide it, like I could pretend I was not falling apart right in front of him. But the truth was already there, visible in every movement I could not control. "I am fine," I said again, the same lie, the same fragile attempt to hold on to something that no longer existed. And this time he did not challenge it, did not argue. He just leaned back slightly, his eyes still on me, and said, "You do not look fine." And something in the way he said it made my chest tighten because it was not judgment, it was not pity, it was simply acknowledgement, and I had not realized how long it had been since someone acknowledged anything about me without dismissing it or turning it into something else. And I swallowed hard, my throat dry despite the rain that had soaked through everything, and I forced myself to ask the question that had been building in the back of my mind since the moment I stepped into this car. "Where are you taking me?" And the words felt small compared to the weight of everything else, compared to the uncertainty that stretched out in front of me like an endless road. And he answered without hesitation, without looking away, "Somewhere warm," he said, and there was something about the simplicity of that answer that made it feel more real than any explanation could have. And I nodded slightly, because I did not have the energy to question it, did not have the strength to demand details or set boundaries or pretend I was still in control of anything. And the car continued moving through the city, smooth, steady, the kind of motion that made it easy to forget where you had come from if you let yourself. And I watched the streets change outside the window, from narrow, dimly lit roads to wider avenues lined with buildings that looked like they belonged in a different world, cleaner, quieter, more distant from the chaos I had just left behind, and I felt something strange settle inside me. Not comfort, not yet, but something close to it, something like the absence of immediate danger, and it was enough to make my shoulders drop slightly, enough to make my breathing slow down just a little, and he noticed that too. Of course he did. And after a moment he reached forward, pressing a button I had not seen before, and the partition between us and the driver slid up silently, cutting off the rest of the world completely, leaving just the two of us, in a space that suddenly felt even smaller, even more contained, and I stiffened slightly at the change, my instincts still unsure, still trying to catch up with everything that was happening. And he watched that reaction as well, his expression shifting just enough to show that he understood it. And he said quietly, "No one will bother you here." And I did not know why those words affected me the way they did, but they did. They settled somewhere deep, somewhere I had not realized was still waiting for something like that. And I closed my eyes for a second, just a second, letting the warmth of the car sink into my skin, letting the steady hum of the engine replace the sound of rain that had been pounding in my ears for what felt like hours. And when I opened them again, he was still there, still watching, still present in a way that felt almost overwhelming. And I realized then that this was not just about being picked up off the side of the road. This was something else, something I could not name yet, something that had started the moment he stepped out of that car and decided I was not someone to leave behind. And that thought both comforted and unsettled me at the same time, because I did not know what it meant to be chosen like that, did not know what it would cost or what it would change. And before I could stop myself, I asked, "Why did you stop?" And the question hung between us, heavier than anything I had said before, because it was not really about the car or the rain or the moment. It was about everything, about him, about me, about the reason our paths had crossed at all. And he did not answer right away. He studied me for a long second, like he was deciding how much to say, how much I was ready to hear. And then he leaned forward slightly, his voice low, steady, because no one else did. He said, and the simplicity of it hit harder than anything else could have, because it was true, because it was enough, and because it made me realize just how invisible I had been before this moment, how easy it had been for everyone else to look away. And I felt something shift again inside my chest, something fragile, something I was not ready to name. And I looked away, back at the window, at the city that no longer felt like it belonged to me, and I whispered, almost to myself, "He was not always like this." And I did not know why I said it, did not know why I felt the need to defend someone who had just left me standing in the rain like I did not matter, but the words came out anyway, automatic, familiar, the echo of something I had been telling myself for too long. And beside me he did not react the way I expected. He did not question it or dismiss it. He just said quietly, "People show you who they are when it costs them something." And I felt that settle into me in a way that was both uncomfortable and undeniable. And I did not respond, because I could not, because there was nothing left to argue with. And the car slowed then, turning smoothly onto a long, quiet driveway lined with lights that reflected off the wet pavement like a path leading somewhere I had never been before. And as we approached the large gates that opened without hesitation, I realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that wherever I was going now, it was not temporary. It was not just a stop on the way to somewhere else. It was a place that existed far outside the world I had known. And as the car came to a gentle stop and the engine quieted, he looked at me one more time, his gaze steady, certain, and said, "You are safe here." And for the first time that night, I believed it, even though I had no idea what that really meant. The doors opened before the car fully stopped, not rushed, not chaotic, just precise, like everything here moved on an invisible signal I could not see. And I hesitated for half a second before stepping out, my legs still unsteady, the ground beneath me too solid after everything that had just happened. And the first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty, but the kind that feels controlled, protected, like even the air knew where it was allowed to go. And I wrapped the coat tighter around myself as I looked up, taking in the building in front of me, tall, clean lines, soft golden lights glowing through large windows, nothing loud or flashy, but everything about it spoke of power that did not need to prove itself. And I felt small standing there, not in a way that made me want to disappear, but in a way that made me realize how far I had just stepped out of my own world. And behind me the car door closed quietly, sealing that moment. And when I turned, he was already there, standing beside me like he had never left, his presence steady, unshaken by the rain that still fell around us. And for a second I did not move because I did not know what was expected of me. Did not know if I was supposed to follow, to speak, to thank him, to leave, but he solved that uncertainty the same way he had solved everything else so far. Without asking, without hesitation, he simply turned and said, "Come," and started walking toward the entrance, and I followed because there was nothing else to do, because the alternative was standing outside alone again, and I had already learned what that felt like. And as we stepped inside, the warmth hit me immediately, not just from the temperature, but from the atmosphere itself, soft lighting, polished floors. The faint scent of something clean and calm that made the tension in my shoulders ease just slightly, and I became aware of how out of place I must have looked, soaked, barefoot, wrapped in a coat that clearly did not belong to me, standing in a space that looked like it belonged in a different life entirely. And I instinctively pulled the coat closer, as if it could hide all of that, as if it could make me belong here even for a moment. And a man approached from the side, dressed in a dark suit, his posture straight, his expression neutral but attentive, and he nodded slightly toward the man beside me, not speaking, just acknowledging. And I realized then that this was not just a house, not just a place someone lived. It was something more structured, more intentional. And the realization settled quietly in the back of my mind as the man spoke, his voice calm, respectful. "Everything is ready." And I felt a flicker of confusion because I did not know what that meant, did not know what had been prepared, or when, or why. And the man beside me gave a slight nod in response before turning his attention back to me, his gaze softer now, but still steady, still certain. "You need to get warm," he said, and I almost laughed at how simple that sounded compared to everything else. But the truth was I did. I needed warmth. I needed something solid, something safe, something that did not disappear the moment I reached for it. And I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. And he gestured slightly toward the hallway ahead. "They will take care of you," he added, and I hesitated then, just for a second, because something in that sentence felt final, like a shift, like a moment where I would no longer be standing next to him, no longer under the direct certainty of his presence. And I did not understand why that mattered as much as it did, but it did, and I looked at him, really looked this time, trying to read something in his expression, something that would tell me what this meant, what came next. But his face gave nothing away except that same calm control that had been there from the beginning. And I realized then that I had no idea who he was. Not really. I did not know his name, did not know why he had stopped, did not know why he had brought me here instead of anywhere else. And yet I had followed him without question, and that realization should have scared me more than it did. But instead it just made me feel tired, tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. And I whispered, almost without thinking, "Why are you doing this?" And the question felt different this time, quieter, more honest, not defensive, not demanding, just real. And for the first time since I had met him, he paused, just for a moment, his eyes studying me like he was considering something, like he was deciding how much truth to give. And then he stepped closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough that his voice did not need to rise above the quiet of the room when he said, "Because you needed someone to." And there was no hesitation in it, no second meaning, no condition attached, just a statement that settled into me in a way I was not prepared for, and I felt my throat tighten again, not from cold this time, but from something else, something I had not felt in a long time, and I nodded, because I did not trust myself to speak without breaking whatever fragile balance I was holding together. And he seemed to understand that, because he did not push, did not wait for more. He simply stepped back slightly and gestured again toward the hallway, and the man in the suit moved forward, his expression still neutral, but his tone gentle when he spoke to me. "This way." And I followed, my steps slow, my mind still trying to process everything that had happened, every moment that had led me from standing alone in the rain to walking through a place that felt more like a sanctuary than anything I had known. And as I reached the end of the hallway, I glanced back, just once, and he was still standing there, exactly where I had left him, watching, not in a way that felt controlling, but in a way that felt certain, like he was making sure I got where I needed to go, like he had already decided something about me that I had not yet realized myself. And that thought stayed with me as I stepped into the room they had prepared, warm, quiet, untouched by the storm outside. And for the first time that night, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I was not alone anymore. I stood there for a moment after the door closed behind me, not moving, not speaking, just listening to the quiet settle around me like it had been waiting, like this room had existed long before I stepped into it, and would continue existing long after I left. And I realized how strange that felt, to be somewhere untouched by what had just happened, to be in a space where nothing echoed the rain, the cold, the sound of tires pulling away, and it made everything inside me feel louder by comparison, every thought, every memory, every question I had not yet asked. And I slowly walked further into the room, my bare feet sinking into the softness of the carpet, the warmth rising up through my body in a way that felt almost overwhelming after being outside for so long. And I wrapped the coat tighter around myself again, even though I no longer needed it for warmth. Because it felt like the only thing anchoring me to what had just happened, the only thing proving that this was real, and not something my mind had created to protect itself. And I glanced around, taking in the details, the bed neatly made, the soft lighting, the folded clothes placed carefully at the foot like someone had anticipated my arrival long before I even knew I would be here. And that thought made me pause because it meant this was not random. This was not accidental. This had been decided, planned in a way I could not yet understand. And I felt a flicker of unease at that realization, not fear. Exactly, but awareness, the kind that reminds you that you are no longer in control of the situation, that you are stepping into something larger than yourself. And I moved toward the bathroom almost without thinking, drawn by the sound of running water that had already been prepared, steam rising softly in the air, as if someone had known exactly what I would need before I could ask for it. And I hesitated at the doorway, my hand resting lightly against the frame as I looked at my reflection in the mirror. And for a second I did not recognize the person staring back at me, her hair tangled and wet, her face pale, her eyes tired in a way that went deeper than exhaustion. And I reached up slowly, brushing a strand of hair away from my face, trying to find something familiar in the reflection, something that told me I was still the same person I had been earlier that evening. But the truth was I did not feel the same. Something had shifted, something quiet but undeniable, and I stepped inside, letting the coat slide off my shoulders and rest carefully on the counter, my fingers lingering on the fabric for a second longer than necessary before I turned toward the shower. And the warmth of the water hit my skin slowly, gently, not shocking, not overwhelming, just enough to begin washing away the cold that had settled into my bones. And I closed my eyes, letting the sound of it fill the space, letting it drown out everything else for just a moment. And I realized then how tired I was, not just physically, but in a way that made it hard to hold on to anything, hard to think clearly, hard to remember where one moment ended and the next began. And I leaned my head slightly against the wall, breathing slowly, trying to piece together everything that had happened, from the argument to the silence to the car to him, always coming back to him, to the way he had looked at me, to the way he had spoken, to the way he had made decisions without hesitation as if there had never been another option. And I did not know what to do with that, did not know how to process someone who acted like that, who moved through the world with that kind of certainty. And while I stepped out, wrapping myself in one of the towels that had been placed neatly within reach, the softness of it unfamiliar against my skin, and I changed into the clothes that had been left for me, simple, comfortable, but clearly chosen with intention, as if someone had considered what I would need rather than what would impress me. And that detail stayed with me as I moved back into the room, drying my hair slowly, my movements quieter now, more deliberate, like I was afraid to disturb something fragile in the air. And when I finally sat down on the edge of the bed, I felt the weight of everything settle again, heavier now that the immediate discomfort was gone, heavier now that I could actually think. And I looked toward the door, half expecting it to open, half expecting him to walk in the same way he had appeared outside, without warning, without hesitation, but it remained closed, the silence stretching out again. And I realized then that this was the first moment I had been alone since everything had changed. And instead of feeling relief, I felt something else, something unexpected, something close to uncertainty, because being alone meant I had to face the questions I had been avoiding, had to acknowledge that I had no idea what came next, that I had stepped into a situation I did not understand with a man I did not know. And yet somehow I trusted him more than the person I had built my life around. And that thought should have scared me more than it did. But it did not. It just made me feel aware of how much I had been ignoring before, how many signs I had overlooked, how many times I had told myself things would get better, when they had only gotten worse. And I pressed my hands lightly against my knees, grounding myself in the present, in the reality of where I was now, and I whispered softly into the quiet, "What am I doing here?" Not expecting an answer, not even sure I wanted one, but the question lingered anyway, hanging in the air like something unfinished, and I did not know how long I sat there, lost in thought, before there was a soft knock at the door, just enough to pull me back, just enough to remind me that I was not completely alone in this place. And I straightened slightly, my breath catching for a second before I said, "Come in," my voice steadier than I felt. And the door opened slowly, revealing the same man from earlier, his posture unchanged, his expression calm. But there was something different now, something more attentive, as if he had been waiting for this moment. And he stepped inside just enough to meet my gaze before speaking. "He would like to see you." And the words settled into the room quietly, but they carried weight, the kind that shifts everything without needing to raise its voice. And I felt my heart beat a little faster at the implication, at the realization that this moment had been coming, that everything so far had been leading to this. And I nodded slowly, rising from the bed, my hands steady even though my thoughts were not. And as I followed him toward the door, I could not shake the feeling that whatever happened next would change everything. Again, just like it had the moment I stepped into that car. The hallway felt longer on the way out than it had when I first walked in. Or maybe it was just me. Maybe it was the way every step now carried weight, carried expectation, and I followed in silence, my bare feet making almost no sound against the floor as the man in front of me moved with quiet precision, like he had walked this path 1,000 times and never once needed to think about where he was going. And I tried to steady my breathing, tried to keep my thoughts from racing too far ahead. But they kept circling back to the same point, to him, to the man waiting at the end of this walk, the one who had stepped out of the rain like it belonged to him, the one who had decided, without asking, that I was not someone to leave behind. And I did not know what that meant yet, did not know what he expected from me or what he had already decided. And that uncertainty sat quietly in my chest, not sharp enough to be fear, but present enough that I could not ignore it. And we turned a corner, then another, the space opening up slightly as the lighting shifted, warmer here, softer, and I realized we were moving deeper into the house, into a part that felt more private, more intentional. And when we finally stopped, it was in front of a set of double doors, tall, dark wood, polished to a shine that reflected the light in a muted glow. And the man paused for a second before reaching out and knocking once, firm but respectful, and I felt my heartbeat pick up just slightly, not loud, not overwhelming, just enough to remind me that this moment mattered, that whatever happened next would not be small. And there was a brief silence before a voice came from inside, calm, steady, unmistakable, "Come in." And the doors opened smoothly, revealing a room that felt different from the rest of the house, not colder, not warmer, just more focused, like everything inside it had a purpose. And he was there, standing near the large window that overlooked the grounds, his back partially turned, his posture relaxed but controlled, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And for a second I hesitated at the threshold, my instincts unsure whether to step forward or stay where I was. But then he turned, and his eyes found mine immediately, and that hesitation disappeared, replaced by something else, something steadier, something that made me take a step inside without being told. And the doors closed quietly behind me, sealing the space in a way that felt deliberate. And the man who had led me here stepped back, positioning himself near the wall, present but unobtrusive. And I was suddenly very aware that this moment was not about anyone else. It was about me and him. And the way he looked at me now was different from before, still steady, still certain, but there was something more in it, something assessing, like he was seeing me not just as I was in that moment, but as something else entirely, something I had not yet understood. And I felt my hands tighten slightly at my sides, grounding myself, reminding myself to breathe. And he took a step closer, not rushing, not invading, just closing the distance enough that his presence felt more immediate, more real. And he spoke, his voice calm, measured. You look better. And I almost smiled at that, at the simplicity of it, at the way he acknowledged the change without making it something bigger than it needed to be, and I nodded slightly. Thank you, I said, my voice steady, even though my thoughts were anything but. And there was a brief pause, not awkward, not tense, just quiet, like he was giving me space to settle into the moment, to adjust to the shift from being alone to standing here in front of him again. And then he moved past me slightly, gesturing toward a chair near the center of the room. Sit, he said, and again it was not a command that felt forced. It was simply expected, and I followed, lowering myself into the chair, my posture straight, my hands resting lightly in my lap as I looked up at him, waiting, not because I had to, but because I felt like this was the moment where things would start to make sense, or at least begin to. And he remained standing for a moment longer before taking a seat across from me, the space between us intentional, close enough for conversation, far enough to maintain that sense of control he seemed to carry with him everywhere. And he studied me again, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me feel like he was paying attention to every detail, every small shift, every breath. And then he spoke. Do you know where you are? And I shook my head slightly. No, I admitted, because there was no point pretending otherwise. And he nodded once, like that answer confirmed something he already knew. And then he leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged. Good, he said. And I blinked, caught off guard by that response, by the fact that not knowing seemed to be the right answer. And before I could question it, he continued. It means you are not tied to anything here yet. And I felt that settle into me, the implication of it, the suggestion that this place, this moment, this situation, was something separate from everything I had known before, something new, something that had not yet been defined. And I swallowed lightly, my mind trying to keep up, trying to understand what he meant, and I asked, quietly, and what is this place? And he held my gaze for a second longer before answering. It is where you do not get left behind. And the words hit differently than I expected, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just certain, and I felt something shift again, something small but undeniable, and I looked down for a moment, processing that, letting it settle, and when I looked back up, he was still watching, still present, still exactly the same as he had been from the moment I met him, and yet everything felt different now, because I was no longer standing in the rain, I was no longer trying to survive the moment, I was here, sitting across from someone who had already changed the course of my night, maybe even more than that. And I realized then that this was not just about what had happened, it was about what would happen next, and I did not know if I was ready for that. But I also knew I could not walk away from it. Not anymore. Not after everything that had already begun, and he seemed to understand that without me saying a word, because he leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, more focused. Tell me, he said, why did he leave you there? And the question settled into the room like a quiet weight, not demanding, not accusing, just waiting. And for the first time since I stepped into this house, I realized that this was not just about being saved. This was about being seen, fully, completely, without the option to hide. And I took a slow breath, knowing that whatever I said next would matter more than anything I had said so far. I did not answer right away because the truth was not a single moment. It was not one sentence I could give him and be done with it. It was something layered, something I had been slowly ignoring until it became impossible to ignore anymore. And I felt his gaze on me, steady, patient, not rushing me, not filling the silence, just waiting. And that made it harder somehow, because I could not hide behind interruption or distraction. I had to choose what to say, and I looked down at my hands for a second, the way my fingers curled slightly against each other, grounding myself before I spoke. He said I embarrassed him. I started quietly, my voice even but softer than before, and the words sounded small in the space between us, almost insignificant compared to everything that had happened, but they were true, or at least part of the truth, and I felt his attention sharpen slightly, not visibly, but enough that I could feel it, like the air had shifted just a fraction, and I continued. We were at dinner, with people he wanted to impress, people who mattered to him, and I paused, the memory clearer now, the way the evening had started normal, almost calm, and then slowly turned into something else, something colder, something sharper. I said. Something he did not like. I added. And I almost smiled at how simple that sounded, how it reduced everything to something so easy to say. But it had not been simple, not really, and I took a breath, letting the rest come out before I could stop it. He said I did not know how to behave, that I made him look weak. And the word weak stayed in the air for a moment, heavier than the others, and I glanced up briefly, meeting his eyes, wondering if he would react to that, if it meant something in his world the way it had meant something in mine. But his expression did not change, it just absorbed the information, and I continued, my voice steadier now that I had started. I tried to explain. I told him I did not mean anything by it, that I was just talking, but he did not want to hear it. And I shook my head slightly, more at myself than anything else. He never wants to hear it when it does not match what he has already decided. And that felt closer to the truth, closer to something real, and I felt my shoulders drop just slightly as I said it, like I had been holding that realization in for longer than I realized. And I went on, we left early. He was quiet at first, just driving, not saying anything. And I thought maybe that was better, maybe silence meant it would pass. But then he started talking again, and it was not really talking, it was listing things, everything I had done wrong, everything I should have done differently, everything I was not. And I stopped there for a second, the words catching slightly, not because they were hard to say, but because they were too familiar, too repeated, and I forced myself to continue. And I tried to stay calm. I tried not to make it worse, but it did not matter. It never really matters, because once he starts, he does not stop until he feels like he has made his point. And I let out a slow breath, my hands tightening just slightly before relaxing again. And I looked back at him, my voice quieter now, so I asked him to pull over. And that part still surprised me, even now, even sitting here, because it had been the first real decision I had made for myself in a long time. And I saw something shift in his expression then. Not much, just a slight narrowing of his eyes, like that detail mattered, like it changed something in the story, and I nodded once, confirming it even before he asked. I did not want to keep listening, I said. I just wanted it to stop, and the room stayed quiet for a second after that, the weight of those words settling between us, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, not relief, not exactly, but something close to it. Something that came from finally saying it out loud instead of replaying it in my head. And then I added, softer now. I thought he would calm down if we stopped. I thought maybe if I stepped out for a minute, he would follow, or at least wait. And I gave a small, almost humorless breath at that, because even as I said it, I knew how that sounded, how much I had been hoping for something that had not been there for a long time. And I looked down again, my voice dropping just a little more. But he did not, I said. And that was the simplest part of the story, the part that did not need explanation, the part that had led to everything else. And I felt the silence stretch again, but it was different now, not empty, not uncertain, just full, like it was holding everything I had just said. And I waited, not because I expected him to fix it or respond in a certain way, but because I knew he would say something. I could feel it, the same way I had felt every decision he had made so far. And after a moment, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady on mine, and he said, "You asked him to stop," and it was not a question, it was a confirmation, and I nodded. "Yes," I said, and he held that for a second before continuing, his voice calm but more focused now. And he chose to leave instead, and I felt something tighten again at the way he framed it, not as something that happened, but as something that was chosen, deliberate, intentional, and I nodded again, slower this time. "Yes," I repeated, and he leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable, but there was something there now, something sharper beneath the calm, something that made the room feel just a little more still, and he said quietly, "That tells me everything I need to know." And I did not know exactly what he meant by that, did not know what conclusions he had drawn or what decisions he had already made in his mind, but I felt the weight of it anyway, the certainty in his voice, the way he spoke as if the situation was already clear, already defined. And I realized then that this was not just about me explaining what happened. This was about him understanding it in a way that would shape what came next. And I sat there, looking at him, waiting, not because I had to, but because I needed to know what he would do with the truth I had just given him. And something in his gaze told me that whatever it was, it would not be small. He did not respond immediately. And somehow that silence said more than words could have. Because it was not hesitation, it was calculation, the kind that did not rush, the kind that did not need to. And I watched him as he leaned back slightly, one hand resting against the arm of the chair, his posture relaxed but controlled. Like nothing about this situation surprised him, like he had already seen versions of this story before and knew exactly where they led. And that thought unsettled me more than anything else, not because I doubted him, but because it made me realize how predictable my life must have looked from the outside, how obvious the cracks had been to someone who knew how to see them. And I shifted slightly in my seat, my fingers tightening just for a moment before I forced them to relax again, grounding myself, reminding myself that I was here now, not there, not in that car, not standing in the rain waiting for something that was never coming back. And he finally moved, just slightly, leaning forward again, his gaze locking onto mine with a focus that made it impossible to look away. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, but there was something else underneath it now, something sharper, more defined. He made a decision, he said, and I felt the weight of those words settle in my chest again. Because he was not talking about emotions or mistakes or misunderstandings, he was talking about choice, about something deliberate, and I nodded slowly, because I understood that now, even if I had not wanted to before. And he continued, "And so did you." And that caught me off guard, my brows pulling together slightly as I looked at him, because I had not thought of it that way, had not framed my own actions as a decision in the same way. And he seemed to notice that shift in my expression, because his tone softened just slightly as he added, "You chose to step out." And I let that sit for a second, replaying the moment in my mind, the way I had opened the door, the way I had stepped onto the pavement expecting something else to follow, something better, something that never came. And I nodded again, quieter this time. "Yes," I said, and he held my gaze for a second longer before speaking again. "That matters." And I blinked slightly, not understanding what he meant at first, not fully, and he leaned back again, giving the words space, letting them settle instead of explaining them immediately. And I realized then that he was not just listening to my story, he was interpreting it, breaking it down into something more than what I had experienced, something clearer, something sharper. And I felt a strange mix of discomfort and clarity at that realization, because part of me wanted to hold on to the idea that things had just happened, that I had not had control, that I had not had a choice. But another part of me, a quieter part, recognized the truth in what he was saying, that I had chosen something, even if I had not understood the full weight of that choice at the time. And I shifted slightly in my seat, my voice softer now, more thoughtful. "It did not feel like a choice," I admitted, and he tilted his head just slightly, considering that, before responding. "It rarely does when it is the right one." And that stayed with me, the way he said it, the certainty in it, the lack of doubt. And I found myself looking at him differently for a moment, not just as the man who had pulled me out of the rain, but as someone who operated on a different understanding of things, someone who saw patterns and decisions where I had only seen confusion and reaction. And I exhaled slowly, my shoulders easing just a fraction as I processed that. And then he added, his voice lower now, more deliberate, "But what comes after is always a choice." And I felt my breath catch slightly at that, because I knew what he meant, even if he had not said it directly, even if he had not framed it as a question. It was one, hanging there between us, waiting for me to acknowledge it. And I looked down for a second, my thoughts moving quickly now, considering what that meant, considering where I was, who I was sitting across from, what had already happened, and what had not yet been decided. And I realized then that this moment was different from the others, that this was not about survival or reaction. This was about direction, about what I would do next. And that realization both steadied me and unsettled me at the same time, because it meant responsibility, it meant ownership, it meant I could not pretend anymore that things were just happening to me without my involvement. And I lifted my gaze back to his, meeting it fully this time, not hesitating, not looking away. And I asked quietly, but clearly, "What happens now?" And the question felt heavier than anything I had said so far, because it was not about the past, it was about the future, about something that had not yet been defined. And he held my gaze for a long second, studying me in a way that felt different from before, less observational, more deciding, like he was measuring something, not my words, but my understanding, my readiness. And then he stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a smooth, controlled. Movement that shifted the energy in the room instantly, and I felt my body respond to that without thinking, my posture straightening slightly, my attention sharpening, and he walked a few steps toward the window, looking out for a moment before turning back to me. His expression unchanged, but his presence somehow stronger now, more defined. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same calm authority, but there was something else in it now, something that felt final. Now, he said, you decide if you go back. And the words landed with a quiet force, not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable, and I felt something in my chest tighten at the simplicity of it, at the way he had reduced everything to that single point, that single decision. And I knew immediately that going back did not just mean returning to a place, it meant returning to a version of myself, to a pattern, to something I had just stepped away from. And I looked at him, really looked this time, seeing the certainty in his stance, the absence of hesitation, and I realized that he was not going to tell me what to do. He was not going to push or persuade. He was simply placing the truth in front of me and letting me face it. And that realization made my heartbeat steady in a way I did not expect, because for the first time in a long time, I felt like the next step was actually mine to take. And I sat there, the silence stretching again. But this time it was not heavy. It was open, waiting, and I knew that whatever I said next would not just answer his question, it would define everything that came after. I did not answer him right away because the word back felt heavier than anything else he had said so far, heavier than the rain, heavier than the silence, heavier even than the moment he found me standing alone on that empty road. And I sat there with my hands resting in my lap, staring at nothing for a second while my mind tried to process what that actually meant, because going back was not just a direction, it was a return to something I had already felt slipping away long before tonight, something I had been holding together out of habit more than belief, and I realized then that I could still picture it clearly, the apartment, the way everything was arranged just right, the way I had learned to move carefully through my own space, to avoid certain topics, certain tones, certain moments that could shift everything without warning, and I felt my chest tighten slightly at that memory, not from fear, but from recognition, from the quiet understanding that I had already been leaving long before I stepped out of that car. And I lifted my gaze slowly, meeting his eyes again, and he did not interrupt, did not rush me. He just watched, steady, patient, like he knew this was not a question that could be answered quickly, and I swallowed lightly, my voice quieter now but clearer than it had been before. If I go back, I said, the words forming carefully, nothing changes, and as soon as I said it, I knew it was true, not something I was guessing, not something I was hoping, just something I understood in a way I could not ignore anymore. And I saw something shift in his expression. Then, not approval, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement, like I had reached a point he expected me to reach. And I continued, my voice gaining a little more strength. It will be the same conversation, the same apologies, the same promises that sound right in the moment and disappear later. And I shook my head slightly, more to myself than to him. And I will tell myself it will be different this time, because that is what I have always done. And the words felt heavier the more I said them. Not because they were difficult, but because they were honest, because they stripped away the excuses I had been using for so long. And I looked down again for a brief second, then back up, holding his gaze. But it will not be different. I finished, and the room stayed quiet after that, the weight of that truth settling between us. And I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, not relief, not yet, but something close to clarity, something that made everything feel sharper, more defined. And he nodded once, a small movement, but deliberate, and he stepped a little closer, not enough to close the distance completely, just enough to shift the space between us, and he said, then do not go back. And the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because I had expected something more complicated, something that required explanation or justification. But there was none of that in his tone, just certainty, just a statement that did not need anything else to support it. And I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it, just disbelief at how simple it sounded when said out loud. And I leaned back slightly in my chair, my fingers curling against the fabric as I tried to process that. It is not that easy, I said, and he tilted his head slightly, studying me again. And for a moment I thought he might challenge that, might push back. But instead he asked, quietly, "What makes it difficult?" And the question was so direct, so clear, that it left no room to hide behind general answers, and I hesitated for a second, because I knew the answer. I had always known it, but saying it out loud made it real in a way that thinking it never had, and I took a slow breath. Before answering, "Everything I have built is tied to him," I said. "The apartment, the routines, the way my life is structured, it all connects back to him." And I paused, the weight of that settling in, before adding, "Softer now. And if I walk away from that, I do not know what is left." And that was the truth, the part that had kept me where I was for so long. The uncertainty of what came after, the fear of stepping into something undefined, something that did not have clear edges or expectations. And I looked at him, searching his expression for something, anything that would tell me how he saw that. And he did not look surprised, did not look concerned. He just looked certain, and he took another step closer, stopping just in front of me now, his presence filling the space in a way that felt steady rather than overwhelming. And he said, "What is left is what you choose to keep." And I felt my breath catch slightly at that, because it shifted everything again. It reframed the question, turned it from something passive into something active, something that depended on me rather than on what I was leaving behind. And I sat there for a second, letting that settle, letting it sink in. And I realized then that I had been looking at it the wrong way, that I had been asking what I would lose instead of what I would take with me. And that change in perspective felt small, but it opened something inside me, something that had been closed for a long time. And I looked up at him again, my voice steadier now, more certain. "And if I do not know what that is yet?" I asked, and he did not hesitate, did not need to think. "Then you find out," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made it feel possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. And I felt a slow, unfamiliar sense of resolve begin to build in my chest, not loud, not overwhelming, just present, just enough to make me sit a little straighter, to make me breathe a little deeper. And I realized then that this moment was not about him giving me answers. It was about him showing me that I could choose them for myself. And that realization stayed with me as I looked at him, as I felt the weight of everything shift slightly, as I understood that whatever came next, whatever I decided, it would not be because I had nowhere else to go. It would be because I chose not to go back, and that difference mattered more than I had ever realized. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and I realized the silence no longer felt heavy the way it had before. It did not press against me or demand something from me. It simply existed, open and steady, like it was giving me space to breathe, to think, to become aware of something I had not allowed myself to feel in a long time. And I sat there, looking at my hands, noticing how they had stopped shaking, noticing how the tension that had lived in my shoulders for what felt like months had begun to loosen without me even realizing it. And that small change felt bigger than it should have, because it meant something inside me had shifted, something quiet but undeniable. And I lifted my gaze again, meeting his eyes, and this time I did not feel the same uncertainty I had felt before. There was still unknown, still questions, but there was also something else now, something steadier, something that felt like the beginning of a decision. And I spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. "I am not going back." And the words settled between us, simple, direct, but they carried more weight than anything I had said so far, because they were not about explaining the past. They were about choosing the future. And I felt at the moment I said them, the way something inside me aligned, the way the uncertainty shifted into something more defined. And he did not react immediately, did not interrupt or respond right away. He just watched me, his gaze steady, as if he was measuring the truth of what I had just said, not the words themselves, but the intention behind them. And after a second, he nodded once, a small movement, but it felt like confirmation, like acknowledgement. And he said, "Good." And there was no surprise in his voice, no question, just certainty, like he had already known that was where I would land. And I let out a slow breath, not realizing until then how much I had been holding in, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, the tension in my body easing just a little more. And for the first time since this night began, I felt something close to control, not over everything, not over what had already happened, but over what came next. And that realization grounded me in a way I had not expected. And I looked at him again, my voice quieter now, but steadier. "So what does that mean?" I asked, because choosing not to go back was one thing, but understanding what came after was something else entirely. And he held my gaze for a second, considering, before he moved again, stepping to the side slightly, his attention shifting just enough to signal that the conversation was changing, evolving. And he said, "It means you stay here." And I blinked slightly at that, not because it surprised me, but because of how direct it was, how easily he said it, like it was already decided, like it had been decided the moment he opened that car door. And I felt a flicker of something in my chest, not fear, but awareness, the realization that staying here was not a small thing. It was not temporary, it was not casual, it was a step into something I still did not fully understand. And I tilted my head slightly, studying him. "Just like that?" I said, not challenging, just trying to understand, and he nodded once. "Just like that," he confirmed, and there was no hesitation in it, no explanation, just certainty. And I let that settle for a second, letting the simplicity of it contrast with the complexity of everything else. And I realized then that this was how he operated, not by overcomplicating things, not by getting lost in uncertainty, but by seeing what needed to be done and doing it. And that clarity was both unsettling and reassuring at the same time. And I stood slowly, not because he told me to, but because something in me wanted to meet him on equal footing, wanted to feel the ground beneath my feet as I made this decision fully. And I took a small step forward, closing some of the distance between us, and I asked, more directly now, "Why?" And the question was simple, but it held everything I had not yet said, everything I had been wondering since the moment he stopped that car. And he looked at me, really looked this time, his expression unchanged but his eyes sharper, more focused, and for a second I thought he might not answer, that he might deflect or avoid it. But he did not. He stepped closer as well, matching the space I had closed, and he said, "Because I do not leave things unfinished." And the words echoed what he had said earlier, but they carried more weight now, more intention, and I felt my breath catch slightly at that. Because I understood then that this was not just about kindness, not just about helping someone in a moment of need. This was something else, something more deliberate, something that extended beyond the night, beyond the rain, beyond the immediate situation, and I searched his expression for more, for something that would explain it further, and he gave it to me, not in a long explanation, not in a detailed answer, but in a single, quiet addition. "And you are not something I leave behind." And the way he said it made everything still for a second, the room, the air, even my thoughts, because it was not a suggestion, it was not a question, it was a statement, and I felt something shift again. Deeper this time, something that settled into a place I had not realized was still open, and I did not know exactly what it meant yet, did not know what it would lead to or what it would change, but I knew it mattered, I knew it was real, and I stood there, looking at him, feeling the weight of that moment, the quiet intensity of it, and I realized then that this was not just about being given a place to stay. It was about being chosen in a way I had not experienced before, not conditionally, not temporarily, but with a certainty that did not ask for permission, and that realization both grounded me and pulled me forward at the same time, into something I had not planned, something I had not expected, but something I was no longer willing to walk away from. His words did not feel like a promise. They felt like a decision that had already been made, and that difference settled into me slowly, almost quietly, but it changed the way I stood there, the way I looked at him, the way I understood the space between us, and I realized I was not trying to figure out if I believed him. I already did. What I was trying to understand was what that belief meant for me, what it required, what it would reshape, and I felt my breath steady as I held his gaze, not backing away from it this time, not searching for an escape in the silence. Just staying there, present, and for a moment neither of us moved, the air still but not tense, just full of something unspoken, something that had not yet taken form but was already there, and I became aware of how close we were standing now, not close enough to feel crowded, but close enough that I could sense the quiet control in the way he carried himself, the way nothing about him shifted without intention, and I found myself grounding in that, in the steadiness of it, in the absence of chaos. And I exhaled slowly, my voice softer now, but more certain than it had been all night. "Then I stay," I said, and the words did not feel like a question. They felt like a continuation of what had already begun, and he watched me for a second, just long enough that I knew he was not taking it lightly, that he was not hearing it as something temporary or uncertain. And then he nodded once, a small, deliberate movement that felt like agreement, like acknowledgement, like the final piece of something clicking into place. And he stepped back slightly, not creating distance, but shifting the moment, transitioning it from something intense into something more grounded, more real. And he said, "Good," again, but this time it carried a different weight, less about confirmation, more about acceptance, and I felt that settle into me in a way I did not expect, because I realized I had not just made a decision, I had stepped into something that now had structure, direction, something that would not simply disappear when the moment passed. And I looked around the room for a brief second, noticing it differently now, not as a place I had been brought into, but as a place I was choosing to remain in, and that subtle shift changed everything, and I turned back to him, a question forming before I could stop it. "And tomorrow?" I asked, because staying here tonight was one thing, but what came after was something else entirely, and he did not hesitate, did not need to think. "Tomorrow does not change because you stayed," he said, and I blinked slightly at that, trying to understand, and he continued, "It changes because you chose not to go back," and I felt that settle into me, the distinction, the clarity of it, and I nodded slowly, processing, letting it reshape the way I was thinking about everything. And he moved again, walking toward a small table near the side of the room, picking up something I had not noticed before, a glass of water, which he held out toward me without looking away. And I stepped forward, taking it carefully, my fingers brushing the edge of the glass, and the simple action felt grounding, real, like something normal in the middle of everything that was not. And I took a small sip, the coolness steadying me further, and when I lowered the glass, he was still watching, not intensely, not sharply, just present, and I realized then that he was not filling the silence with unnecessary words. He was letting me adjust, letting me arrive at this new reality in my own time, and that patience felt unfamiliar but not uncomfortable, and I found myself asking another question, quieter this time, more personal. "Do you always do this?" And he tilted his head slightly, considering. "Do what?" he asked, and I held his gaze. "Decide things this quickly," I said, and a faint shift touched his expression, not quite a smile, not quite amusement, but something close, and he answered simply, "Only when the decision is clear." And I let that sit with me, the certainty of it, the confidence in his own judgment, and I realized that from his perspective, this had never been complicated, this had never been uncertain. He had seen something, understood it, and acted on it without hesitation, and that realization both impressed and unsettled me, because it meant I had stepped into a world where things were not delayed or softened or avoided. They were faced directly, decided directly. And I took another slow breath, letting that understanding settle, and I set the glass down carefully on the table beside me, my movements more deliberate now, more grounded, and I looked back at him, my voice steady. "Then what am I to you?" I asked, because the question had been building since the moment he said I was not something he would leave behind, and it felt important now, necessary, and he did not look away, did not deflect, he simply stepped closer again, closing the distance just enough that the answer felt immediate, and he said, "Someone I chose," and the simplicity of it landed deeper than anything more elaborate could have, because it was not dressed up in explanation or justification, it was just truth, direct and unfiltered, and I felt something shift again, not sharply, not dramatically, but in a way that settled into me, that stayed, that made everything feel just a little more real, a little more defined, and I stood there for a moment, holding that, understanding that this was not a temporary moment, not something that would fade when the night ended, but the beginning of something that would continue, something I had stepped into fully the second I said I was not going back. And I realized then that whatever came next, whatever this became, it would not be something I drifted into by accident. It would be something I walked into with my eyes open, and that awareness made me feel steadier than anything else at all night. I did not expect the quiet that followed to feel this steady, this grounded, like something had settled into place without needing to announce itself. And I stood there for a moment, letting his words linger, letting them take shape inside me instead of rushing past them the way I used to with everything else. And I realized I was not trying to question what he meant anymore. I was trying to understand what it meant for me to be the kind of person someone would choose like that, without hesitation, without condition, and that thought stayed with me as I looked at him. Really looked this time. Not just at the surface, not just at the way he carried himself or the control in his movements, but at the consistency behind it, the way nothing about him shifted without intention, the way his presence remained the same from the moment he stepped out of that car to now, and I felt something in my chest tighten slightly. Not from fear, but from recognition, because I realized how different that was from what I had known before, how unstable everything had felt in comparison, how often I had adjusted myself just to keep things from breaking. And I took a slow breath, grounding myself in the present again, in this room, in this moment, and I spoke, quieter now, but more certain than before. "You make it sound simple," I said, and he watched me for a second, considering that, before answering. "It is simple." And I almost smiled at that, not because I believed it entirely, but because of how easily he said it, how natural that perspective seemed to him. And I shook my head slightly, not in disagreement, just in acknowledgement of the difference between us. "It does not feel simple," I admitted, and he nodded once, not dismissing that, not correcting it, just accepting it as part of the truth, and he stepped slightly to the side, moving toward the window again, his gaze shifting outward for a moment, as if giving the conversation space to breathe. And then he spoke, his voice calm, measured. "It rarely feels simple when you have been taught to complicate it." And I felt that settle into me slowly, the way his words always did, not forcing their way in, just existing until I was ready to understand them. And I looked down for a second, my thoughts moving through everything I had accepted as normal for so long, everything I had justified or minimized or ignored. And I realized how much of it had been built on the idea that things had to be difficult to be real, that struggle was something I was supposed to endure rather than question. And I lifted my gaze again, meeting his, and I said quietly, "I think I stopped questioning things a long time ago." And he studied me for a moment, not with judgment, not with sympathy, just with awareness, and he said, "That is why this feels unfamiliar." And I nodded slowly, because that was exactly it. Unfamiliar, not wrong. Not unsafe, just different in a way I had not prepared for. And I took another breath, letting that settle, letting myself stay in that space instead of trying to rush past it. And then I asked, more directly now, "And what happens if I change my mind?" Because the question mattered, not because I planned to, but because I needed to understand the boundaries of this, the reality of it. And he did not hesitate, did not look away. "Then you leave," he said. And the simplicity of that answer caught me off guard again, not because it was harsh, but because it was honest, because it did not try to hold me in place or limit my choice. It simply acknowledged it. And I felt something shift again at that, something that made me sit a little straighter, made me feel a little more secure. And I realized then that this was not about being trapped or controlled. It was about being given a space to choose without pressure, without manipulation, and that difference mattered more than I had expected. And I nodded once, processing that. "And you would just let me go?" I said, and he held my gaze for a second longer before answering. "I do not keep people who do not choose to stay." And the words landed with quiet weight, not threatening, not forceful, just clear, and I felt my breath steady at that, because it confirmed something I had been sensing since the beginning, that this was not about possession in the way I had experienced before. It was about decision, about choice, about something mutual rather than imposed. And I let that settle, letting it reshape the way I understood everything that had happened tonight. And I realized then that the reason I did not feel afraid here was not because I did not understand the situation. It was because I did, because I could see the structure of it, the boundaries of it, the clarity of it. And that clarity made it easier to stand in it without losing myself. And I looked at him again, my voice softer now, but steady. "Then, I am choosing to stay," I said, and this time it felt different from before, not just a reaction, not just a continuation of the moment, but a conscious decision, something I understood and accepted fully. And he nodded once, the same small, deliberate movement, but it carried more weight now, more meaning, like he recognized the difference too, and he stepped back slightly, giving the moment space again. And I felt the room settle around us, the quiet returning, but no longer uncertain, no longer waiting, just present. And I realized then that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something else, something I had not planned, something I had not expected, but something I had stepped into willingly, and that awareness stayed with me as I stood there, steady for the first time all night, knowing that whatever came next, I would not be stepping into it the same way I had stepped into everything before. The room felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because I had, and I stood there for a moment longer, letting that realization settle in fully, not rushing past it, not questioning it, just allowing it to exist, and I became aware of how quiet everything was again, not empty, not tense. Just still, like the kind of stillness that comes after something has been decided, after a shift has taken place that does not need to be undone. And I looked at him, noticing how nothing about him had changed, how his posture remained the same, how his expression held that same calm certainty, and yet the way I saw him now was different, because I was no longer trying to understand him from the outside. I was standing inside the decision that had brought me here, and that changed everything. And I took a slow breath, grounding myself in that, letting it become real. And then I asked, quietly, what does staying here actually mean? Because I understood the choice now, I understood the direction, but I needed to understand the reality of it, the structure of what I had stepped into. And he watched me for a moment, not surprised by the question, not avoiding it, just considering how to answer. And then he moved again, stepping toward the desk near the side of the room, resting one hand lightly against the surface as he turned slightly, facing me but not closing the space completely, and he said, "It means you are not alone anymore." And the words landed gently, but they carried weight, more than I expected, because they touched something deeper than the practical side of things, something that had been present long before tonight, something I had learned to ignore until I could not anymore. And I felt my chest tighten slightly at that, not from discomfort, but from recognition, and I nodded slowly, absorbing it. And he continued, his voice steady. "It means you are protected." And I paused at that, the words settling differently, because it was not something I had associated with my life before, not in a way that felt real, not in a way that did not come with conditions or expectations. And I looked at him more carefully now, trying to understand what that meant coming from him, trying to read the intention behind it. And he did not look away, did not soften or adjust the statement. He just let it stand, and I felt something shift again, something quiet but firm, and I asked, more directly, protected from what? And there was a brief pause, not hesitation, just consideration, and then he answered, from anything that should not reach you. And the way he said it made it feel less like a general statement, and more like something specific, something defined, and I felt a flicker of curiosity at that, a question forming that I was not sure how to ask yet. And I held on to it for a second before letting it go, focusing instead on what I could understand, on what I could accept in this moment. And I nodded once, letting that settle, and then I added, "And what do you expect from me?" Because that mattered too, not as a condition, but as a reality, because nothing existed without some form of exchange, some form of balance. And he studied me for a moment, his expression unchanged, before answering, "Honesty." And I blinked slightly at that. Not because it was surprising, but because it was simple, and I felt myself almost searching for more, for something hidden behind it, something more complex. But there was nothing else, just that one word, clear and direct. And I let out a small breath, processing that. And I nodded slowly. "That I can do," I said. And I meant it, because after everything I had said tonight, after everything I had admitted, I did not feel the need to hold anything back anymore, not in the same way. And he gave a slight nod in return, acknowledging it. And then he stepped away from the desk, closing the distance between us just slightly again. And he said, "Then there is nothing else to explain tonight." And I felt that settle into me, the finality of it, not in a restrictive way, but in a grounding way, like the conversation had reached its natural end, like everything that needed to be said had been said. And I realized how tired I was then, not just physically, but in a way that made my thoughts slower, my body heavier. And I nodded slightly, understanding, and he seemed to notice that immediately, because he stepped back again, giving me space, and said, "You should rest." And there was no command in it, just observation, just something practical, and I found myself agreeing without hesitation, because the idea of stepping away from this moment, of letting everything settle without forcing more into it, felt right. and I turned slightly toward the door, then paused, something pulling me back for just a second, and I looked at him again, meeting his gaze one more time before I left, and I said quietly, "Thank you." And the words felt different this time, not just polite, not just expected, but real, because I understood now what he had done, not just in the moment, but in everything that followed, and he held my gaze for a second, then gave a small nod, the same steady acknowledgement he had given before, and said, "You chose this." And I felt that settle into me one more time, the reminder, the grounding truth of it, and I nodded in return, accepting it fully, and then I turned and walked toward the door, my steps slower now, more deliberate, and as I stepped back into the hallway, I realized something had changed in a way I could not undo, not because I had been brought here, but because I had chosen to stay, and that difference was the first thing that had felt truly mine in a long time. I did not look back as I walked down the hallway, not because I did not want to, but because I knew if I did, something in me might hesitate, might question, might try to hold on to the version of myself that had walked into that room unsure and uncertain, and I was not that person anymore, not in the same way, and my steps felt different now, steadier, more deliberate, like each one carried intention instead of reaction, and I became aware of the quiet again, the controlled stillness of this place. But this time it did not feel unfamiliar. It felt structured, like something I could exist within without losing myself. And I reached the door to the room they had prepared for me earlier, pausing for just a second before stepping inside. And as the door closed behind me, I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, my shoulders relaxing slightly as the weight of everything began to settle, not all at once, not overwhelming, just enough to make me aware of how much had changed in such a short amount of time. And I moved further into the room, my eyes adjusting to the softer lighting, the warmth that had already become familiar, and I sat down on the edge of the bed again, my hands resting lightly against the fabric. Realizing it, not dramatic, not sudden, just lighter, and I let that carry me for a moment longer, my breathing steady, my mind quieting, and just before I drifted into sleep, one thought surfaced clearly, steady and certain, not loud but impossible to ignore, the kind that stays with you long after everything else fades. And it was simple, almost too simple, but it held more truth than anything else I had understood tonight. I was not the person he left in the rain anymore, because I had not stayed there.